Hello, this is Whitney Will of Starhearth Astrology, and I'm here tonight to talk to you about the Gemini full moon penumbral lunar eclipse that takes place really early in the morning on November 30th of 2020. So, there are a few things significant about this lunation, but in terms of the chart, it's not super complicated or super fraught. So I'll kind of start with the kind of big picture where it fits in and some of the more important aspects of it, and then slowly focus on the individual lunation and the eclipse. So this full moon brings us into eclipse season, which, depending on the astrologer you ask, can last different amounts of time. But for me, it starts with the first eclipse and then closes with the first uneclipsed lunation that we have. So a lunation, again, is any new moon or full moon. And so we enter the second eclipse season of 2020 on November 30th, and we will be in eclipse season until December 29th with the Cancer full moon that is uneclipsed. And it's the first Cancer full moon in 2 years to be uneclipsed. So the eclipses have shifted from the signs of Capricorn and Cancer into the signs of Gemini and Sagittarius. And so we will have this eclipse season in November, December of 2020. We will have a kind of May, June eclipse season in 2021, and then we will have the final eclipses in Sagittarius and Gemini again in November, December of 2021. So we really have kind of 3 passes through this territory to tell this story of the rebalancing of the polarity between Gemini and Sagittarius. So we have the South Node in Sagittarius, and the South Node is connected to the past and to things that are maybe it's the moon, and part of what the moon represents is memory. And so it's the stories and the memories that bind us to the past. It can be stuff that we're stuck on, stuff that's due for kind of renovation, or just, especially in the sign of Sagittarius and Gemini, a kind of renaissance of the mind. Whereas the North Node in Gemini is hungry. It is hungry for more, and its thirst kind of creates new life in that sign. So with these series of eclipses, we kind of shed the old material of Sagittarius. It's not working so much for us anymore, and we cultivate the spirit of Gemini and bring some new life in. And now it's very possible that we can swing too far in the other direction. And then in another 9 years, we'll have the South Node move through Gemini and the North Node move through Sagittarius, and they'll be rebalanced in that way. I think one thing that is important, and a good thing for me to always remind myself, is that even as we're kind of teeter-tottering through these signs, there's not a value placed. So we're going to lean more heavily into Gemini and lean away from Sagittarius through this eclipse cycle. But that doesn't mean that, good and bad things will happen on both sides. There's always kind of an absolute value. So there'll be some great new Gemini stuff, but then also the development of some Gemini things that maybe aren't so great. And same thing for Sagittarius. We might throw a few babies out with the bathwater with the South Node in Sagittarius. And similarly, if you think of kind of, if the South Node is sucking poison from a wound, the first thing that happens is you get a mouthful of poison. And so I think when the South Node transits different signs and different houses, right, it calls up the shadow material. And then the thing with shadow material is that once it's exposed, it tends to dissolve fairly quickly. But that doesn't mean that the exposure of the shadow material is easier for anyone. So that's kind of the time, the minefield, the time field that we're in. Which brings me to my next point, which is that sometimes during eclipse season, time gets really weird. And so what I mean by that is things can come up from the past. You can find yourself a little bit obsessive about the past and healing the past and re-understanding things. You can feel like it's present again. And there's a way in which the nodes kind of tie the past to the future. And when they get triggered by eclipses, it feels weird. It's a little bit hard to explain as I'm doing it, but there's a way in which you kind of, if you tune into it, you kind of feel things working on a deeper level. And so it's actually my favorite time to give readings is during eclipse season, not for the kind of like practical, more lifey stuff, but for like the deep, rich soul stories and really penetrating those places. I think the eclipses open a portal to that. And I don't mean physically, I'm not speaking metaphysically, I think, but they just seem to, it's just easier to go deeper in eclipse season. So this coming eclipse, what we're looking at is a full moon in Gemini. And so it has all of the trappings of a full moon. We kind of have a culmination. But often what I find in these culminations is that it is the emotional peak of the lunar month occurs during the full moon. And when we have an eclipse, it's an emotional peak in all caps. These kind of full moon eclipses are kind of the emotional peak of the year. And so they call up stuff that can be kind of shocking to us. And we can see things in a new light. And so when we look at the symbolism of the sun and the moon, we've got the sun as kind of our gateway to the higher self that's receptive to kind of the more spiritual side of things. And then the moon that kind of pulls downwards, that's the soul, that's connective, that's emotional, that's instinctive. And at a full moon, they're at maximum tension. We've got kind of, our desires and our ego drives pulling one way, and then this kind of instinctual balancing that happens with the moon at full force. It's kind of this way of, I feel like the moon, during a full moon will kind of call the bluff of the sun, and kind of remind the sun that it has a body, that it's connected to other people, that it needs emotional grounding. Whereas I kind of feel the sun is more intellectual and tries to transcend the body and transcend the naturally profane nature of our existence here in this world, in these bodies. So some of the yuckier, more mundane things that we have to deal with. So then what happens during a lunar eclipse is that the shadow of the earth goes in between the sun and the moon, and the shadow of the earth is projected. In this case, it's a penumbral, so we really get the edge of it. So we get, the moon won't disappear, but it will go red. And this happens at 2:29 a.m. In Mountain Standard Time. So it should be visible everywhere in the US if you don't have clouds. And if you're awake at that time of night, to watch the moon go red. So there's this way in which the moon is getting the shadow. And so kind of our needs for connection, for community, for for feeling grounded in our bodies can get a little bit complicated. And then the tenor of this eclipse lasts kind of in the short term for the next 2 weeks until the next lunation, which is also an eclipsed new moon, but it's a solar eclipse in Sagittarius. And then kind of for a longer period from the Gemini full moon until the Gemini new moon, which will happen sometime during Gemini season, the end of May through most of June. So we're kind of, there's a way in which these eclipsed full moons can leave us with this sense of floating because the moon itself is obscured. So that is something that you might feel coming off of this. And Gemini is already a sign that it's not super lunar, shall we say. It's ruled by Mercury, intellectual, cerebral, already kind of floating in a more cerebral space. So this kind of cuts the cord even more between them. So that's just something to look out for, getting too in your head. So when we look at the chart of the eclipse, there's really, as I said before, there's not really too many strong aspects, especially aspecting the moon and the sun itself. And now this is not the chart for everyone. This is the chart for where I am in Mountain Standard Time. The planets should all be in the same spaces, but the ascendant and the midheaven are specific to my location. So if you want to cast the chart for your location, you can just put in your location and change the time zone. It happens at 2:29 a.m. Mountain Standard Time, so you can just adjust that for your time zone. The closest aspect that's perfecting within the chart is a sextile from Mercury to Saturn. And this is important because I think that this lunation feels really ungrounded to me. But this Mercury-Saturn sextile kind of adds the earth and the water element that kind of weighs it down a little bit. Unfortunately, I think that this aspect can weigh it down a little bit too much. Saturn, especially Saturn in Capricorn, tends to feel a little bit pessimistic, and Mercury in Scorpio is both suspicious and obsessive. And so there's this kind of could kind of be consumed by some dark thoughts with this approaching sextile. And with the moon eclipsed, it's not going to be able to kind of help you stay in touch with your body to kind of keep you safe from those. So I would just, practice good self-care around this. Don't make sudden movements, especially we've got this separating Venus-Uranus opposition, which can really kind of throw off our values. Or, Venus and Scorpio can get a little bit obsessive, a little bit jealous, and Uranus can definitely trigger that. So it's a little bit volatile. And I mean volatile in the sense that things could change very quickly because there's not too many steadying agents for this full moon lunar eclipse. So I think what we'll see, kind of in the next 2 weeks is some things that surprise us. And that is part of eclipse season as well. It's really hard as an astrologer to say, this eclipse is going to do this to your chart, because sometimes eclipses take 6 months to have an effect. So even if they land on something in your chart, they're not necessarily going to, you're not going to have some event that happens that day. But sometimes it does. And so part of having eclipses, the moon is very related to habit. And eclipses can kind of signify sudden beginnings and sudden endings. And it may not happen right on the day of the eclipse, but within the eclipse season. And sometimes that has to do with epiphanies, which I think is more of the sun. and just like all of a sudden realizing what you need to do and being able to do it because you can see it so clearly, because this other part that has been blocking that has been obscured. Or, right, the moon is eclipsed, and this habit that you couldn't break, whether it is a behavioral habit or a relationship or a story that you were just so fixated on being a certain way, suddenly, the light and the life goes out of it, and you can walk away from things, or you can walk away from your fears about things, and you can begin again. And so we're looking at this is kind of, we're looking at the house of Gemini. So wherever Gemini falls in your chart, looking at, okay, here's the lay of the land in this context. Here is the full moon in this sign, the lay of the land that, for the part that Gemini plays in my individual chart. And so we'll begin to, I think, get thirsty in that space in our lives, so that by the time May and June comes around, we will, it is, let's see, June 10th is going to be that Gemini new moon. So by the time that June 10th comes around, we have kind of taken stock of what we need to cultivate in this area of our lives. And so that is what I will leave you with, this idea about getting curious about where we're thirsty for the Gemini vibe. And the Gemini vibe is about conversation. It's about critical thinking. It's about not reducing things to their simplest terms. It's about finding the stories that reanimate, finding really the magic words to create the reality that is the most expansive. So thank you for listening to this video. If you enjoyed it, please hit like, and I would love it if you would subscribe so you can see all my videos. I also want to drop a note that I am presenting this Friday, December 4th, at the Kitsap Human Rights Conference, which is all virtual and free to register. I will be giving a talk at 3 p.m. Mountain Time on archetypes of astrological archetypes for effective self-care and meaningful participation to look at activism in our lives and what our moon signs tell us about where we can do our best work. So I wish you a happy eclipse. I hope you had a great Thanksgiving, and I'll tune in a couple weeks for the Sagittarius new moon eclipse on December 14th.